Can someone explain to me how rates can stay high for long periods of time? Our debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120, and 80 of the national debt rolls over within 5 years. The current average interest on the national debt is 2.67. Average that together at an 80 weight with 5 and you go to 4.53 from 2.67, and the interest payments on the national debt alone will be 1.1 trillion a year, more than a quarter of all federal tax revenue. Are we really prepared to spend an extra 600 billion a year and watch the national debt eclipse GDP multiple times over in trying to service the further debt we will need to go into to pay that interest over time? Declining tax revenue from the accompanying recession will probably make it even worse. I feel like we are stuck between a rock and a hard place, with high inflation on one side and debt-fueled insolvency on the other. Oddly enough, these rates aren't historically high. These are mostly just numbers and statistics. Sadly, the US is still the safest, most open and liquid market, and as such, if anybody is looking to build any kind of a balance sheet of assets, you'd be hard-pressed to find better market alternative carrying the same risk-adjusted returns. In simple words, our numbers might be crap, but the rest of the world is utterly abysmal, and not just in numbers. They don't care about inflation. Numbers are very easy to rig, and they do every announcement now. They stopped comparing to 2 years of data recently, so the numbers you hear are compared to 1 year ago when it was 9, almost 10. We're now 5-6 officially inflated from the previous year inflation fuckfest of 9-10. They have no reason to be accurate, especially if it'll piss people off, so they fudge and lie to make the terrible numbers seem palatable. They're gonna inflate the debt away and kill 90 of poor and middle-class people in the process. It's definitely costing more to service the debt now, but the government, state, federal are now collecting more tax dollar than ever because of the increase in wages the last couple years. The government has no plan to pay the debt. They will continue to add to it year after year. That's why you keep hearing them fighting about the debt ceiling every couple years. They will try to manage that debt by inflation. Tax the rich. It'll lower inflation and pay for the interest. They got all the bailouts and PPP money anyway. We just need to take it back. Well, I guess the Fed had better stick to the program to ensure they can lower rates by the time the debt rolls over. Any waffling now will only prolong the need for higher rates. Frankly, they could have been even more aggressive about tightening over the past year. We should have been by now at FFR at least as much as the highest inflation was last year, 10 or so. In the 80s, they let off the brake prematurely and then had to slam even harder and longer. That's what the recent rate rise skip felt like. One could argue that debt to GDP is so high because interest rates were low for so long that businesses, individual consumers over-leveraged themselves. Sustained, high interest rates would push these consumers' businesses to be restrained about acquiring future debt. This would allow GDP to catch up to debt again. Rates will stay high because there is inflation, because the HR department needs to get paid, so tack on an extra 5 to 10 cost as long as the pink heads are managing the accounting books nationwide in every boardroom. Our entire system is probably a house of cards. The massive increase in debt over the pandemic, followed by much higher interest rates, seems like a disaster in the making. I don't recall all these tense debt ceiling issues happening 30 years ago, or the student loan forgiveness issue being a thing then either. Seems like a sign that our national debt is getting to be a much bigger problem than it was. On top of that, folks never carried so much expensive debt like credit card debt like they do now. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express, printing money out of thin air since 1913. The interest rates have been artificially low for a decade. The super-rich eliminate saving and force people to put their money into the stock market, where they can steal it a little bit at a time. It's a massive open conspiracy to steal from the working class, and it's worked better than they could have imagined. Looks like the Fed is going to be getting a lot of interest payments. The debt is denominated in US dollars, which the US government controls. Bringing down debt happens through austerity or devaluating the debt through inflation. USA should get its fiscal position in order through reducing entitlement spending, but that is not politically going to happen. We need higher rates. The higher the better to fix this mess. These rates aren't even that high. This was the norm before the 2000s. The US government can always repay all debts in full in US dollars. The government needs to increase taxes and/or reduce spending. The Fed is deliberately insulated from those sorts of political concerns. Inflation isn't that bad. It's bad the way that having only Cheerios when you really want Fruit Loops is bad. As in could be better, but you aren't going to starve. With regard to the debt, most of it is owed to US citizens. It is denominated in dollars, which means we can't default on it unless we decide that we want to. The US has plenty of money available that we are not accessing simply because we would rather not. Military budgets could be cut and taxes are absurdly low. In other words, there is plenty of funding if we really need it. We aren't paying for anything, not directly at least. How do you think the government pays its debts? I'll give you a hint. PRRRRRR. We will pay for it in inflation. And no, the Fed isn't trying to stop inflation, they are trying to return it to a stable 2-3. Ray Dalio has some great material on this. The interest payments on the national debt alone will be $1.1 trillion a year, more than a quarter of all federal tax revenue. Sounds like they will just have to increase taxes then. People forget that not only have rates been at record lows, but tax rates have been as well. Seems like economists don't know how to make an economy durable, or these boom-bust cycles are part of the plan. Don't you know they want you to own nothing? Owning a home will only get harder and harder as the decades roll by, in my opinion. It's an easy fix if laws were passed to give massive tax credits to families buying a home to live in, and for builders to actually make new homes. You'll never see that happen though. Not with this government. Rates are not high. They are actually where they probably should be, historically. It's not up to anyone to decide on the rates. It's always around 3 higher than the 10 years Treasury yield. It is easy to solve the inflation and debt problem if they really want to. Raise tax will do the trick. But the Biden admin is too weak to do it. Sad. Lol, this sub is a step away from QAnon. Because fuck you. That is how. 2 things. X200B. 1. Rates are not historically high RN, just about average over last 30-40 years. X200B. 2. So long as the GDP economy continue to grow, the debt is inflated away. It ultimately doesn't matter according to MMT because the national debt can be increased and the Fed controls interest rates, thus protecting the currency. They can't, and I think this why the Fed was so reluctant to raise them, and then raised them at a record pace. They need to kill inflation before the debt rolls over. It's a problem. No matter what they do now, it's a problem. A lot of the national debt is financed short-term. If rates rise, paying the interest on the debt becomes problematic. But if rates don't rise, they have another set of problems. Our debt as a nation is someone else's credit. Can someone tell me whose? This entity would also think of our payments on debt as income. I think that's how it works, but maybe not. Welcome to the other side of modern monetary theory. It will be shocking and also a bit worrying when people realize we have no plan or intentions to pay that down. I'm surprised it's taking this long for people to wake up. I agree with you, but devil's advocate, by crushing the economy people will bid treasuries as a safe haven asset, leading to reduced interest rate expenses, which keeps it all going for a few more years. National debt interest goes back into the national budget. The central bank is not allowed to profit. It sort of doesn't matter on the federal level except for the purposes of creating a budget. Fugazi, fugazi. It's a wazy. It's a woozy. It's fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It's never landed. It is no matter. It's not on the elemental chart. It's not fucking real.